There were many civilizations in the lands that would later be known as America. These civilizations lived unaware of the rest of the world. Until, in 1492, Italian explorer Christopher Columbus landed on one of the eastern islands. It soon became clear that the land where Columbus set foot was not India or Asia, but a completely different continent. Following this discovery, as the news of the New World spread in Europe, many countries began to organize expeditions to these lands. These expeditions were financed by Spain, England, France and Portugal. This continent was named America by the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller, after another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, who organized expeditions to the continent. About 100 years after the discovery, Europeans began to go to the New World and establish settlements. The colonies created by the British were located on the east coast of North America. As the populations of the colonies increased, the need to expand their settlements arose. So, first of all, they captured the Dutch colony, which they saw as an intruder. They then pushed the Native Americans who were near the colonies westward. The problems with the French in Europe continued here as well. As a result of the war, which took place as part of the 7 Years' War, the British were victorious and dominated half of the continent. After the war, the colonies became even stronger. There were problems and conflicts between them and Britain. The colonies held 2 continental congresses to gain their independence. They signed the Declaration of Independence under the leadership of George Washington at the Second Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. They fought with Britain after the declaration. The war resulted in the victory of the colonies, and with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain recognized the independence of the American colonies. The new nation's borders were between Canada to the north, Florida to the south, and the Mississippi River to the west. The form of government was determined in long constitutional discussions after independence. A strong central government and a union of states under it. With the adoption of the new constitution, the first elections were held in 1789 and George Washington was elected the first president. After independence, people began to move westward and establish settlements. The first settlements were Kentucky in 1792 and Tennessee in 1796. The new president, Thomas Jefferson, thought that the territory of the United States should become larger. He aspired to French lands in the west, and France agreed to sell. They purchased French lands west of the Mississippi River for $15 million. In the south, Spain agreed to give Florida. The growth of industry in the captured lands created the need for transportation. Because of this need, roads, railways and canals were built. Growth continued in the following years due to easier transportation. Americans began to take control of the lands they reached. They first captured Texas and then the entire Pacific coast. The expansion of the territory of the United States increased the tension of the slavery issue. The increase in cotton and tobacco production in the South made the South dependent on slavery. The issues of whether the newly joined members were free or slave states escalated the discussions. Slavery was the main campaign issue of the 1860 election. Abraham Lincoln, from the anti-slavery Republican Party, won the election. However, the Southern states withdrew from the Union and established the Confederate State of America. The American Civil War began in April 1861 with the attack of Confederate forces in South Carolina. Neither side was ready for war, but the North was stronger. In 1863, the Northern Union won major battles in Pennsylvania and Mississippi. The fighting continued until April 1865, when the Confederate general surrendered. A few days after the war ended, President Lincoln was assassinated. The South was placed under military rule and new governments were established. Southern states were readmitted to the Union between 1866 and 1870. In the years after the war, slavery was replaced by a system of sharecropping. Sharecroppers cultivated land in exchange for a share of the products they produced. The population of the United States was about 50 million in 1880. In 1900, this number reached 76 million. The most important reason for the population increase was immigrants looking for a new job and home in a prosperous country. Immigrants until 1890 were mostly from Northern and Western Europe, but after that date the majority were from Eastern and Southern Europeans. The increase in population in the East and the presence of gold in California encouraged people to migrate westward. Some of them started raising cattle in the open lands in the middle of the continent. This caused conflicts with the Native Americans living in the area, and the natives were forced to be exiled. Population growth led to industrial overgrowth in the before 1900s. The development of new methods of steel production and the gasoline-powered engine caused the automobile and other industries to grow tremendously. This growth resulted in a group of business people becoming very rich and monopolizing. These organizations were called trusts, and the Sherman Anti-Trust Act was enacted to prevent monopolization. While these situations continued, the United States seized territory beyond its borders. In 1867, Russia sold Alaska for $7.2 million. In 1898, the United States claimed ownership of the Hawaiian Islands. In the same year, the United States went to war with Spain because it supported the independence movement in Cuba, which was ruled by Spain. At the end of the war, the United States captured Puerto Rico and Guam. After paying Spain $20 million, the United States took over the Philippines. They granted independence to Cuba. The United States wanted to build a canal to Colombia-administered Panama. However, as a result of Colombia's objection, Panama declared independence and the canal was opened in 1914 after 10 years of construction. In 1914, war broke out in Europe. On one side were the Central Powers and on the other side were the Allies. The United States tried to remain neutral, but declared war on the Central Powers in 1917 after German submarines sank U.S. ships. 2 million U.S. troops helped the Allies win the war in Europe. The hostilities ended in November 1918. After the war, Americans demanded all kinds of goods to enjoy peace and prosperity. Banks lent freely to farmers and businessmen to purchase land and machinery. Millions of people bought stocks and bonds seeking to make quick profits. However, in October 1929, a financial panic occurred when thousands of shareholders tried to sell their shares. Prices on the stock market fell and the stock market was plunged into collapse. Farmers and businessmen could not pay their debts to banks. Banks closed down when they could not collect the loans they gave. This collapse, called the Great Depression, first affected America and then the whole world. The new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who took office in 1933, initiated efforts against the crisis. They provided incentives to banks, businessmen and farmers. Thanks to the incentives, production in factories increased, farmers' incomes increased and unemployment decreased. However, salvation would be the production of materials for World War II. In 1939, Germany declared war on Poland. In response to the invasion of Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Shortly after, Germany was joined by Italy and Japan. These countries were called the Axis powers, and the countries opposite them were called the Allies. The United States was providing military aid to the Allies. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The USA declared war on Japan the next day, and on Germany and Italy 3 days later. The United States was not ready for war in the Pacific. The Japanese captured the Philippines and other Pacific islands. U.S. forces fought alongside Allied troops in the Pacific, Europe, and North Africa. Italy surrendered in September 1943. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in France. Within a few months, Germany, left alone in Europe, had to fight against the Soviet armies in the east and the Allied armies in the west. The war in Europe ended with Germany's surrender in May 1945. The USA dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Japan surrendered a few days later. Two great powers fighting against a common enemy during the war. The United States and the Soviet Union entered into a rivalry after the war. While the United States was the leader of the mostly democratic Western nations, the Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe with a communist administration. While the Soviets encouraged the rise of communism, the United States was determined to prevent the spread of communism. This tension was called the Cold War. The USA developed various policies to combat communism. These: the Truman Doctrine, which provided monetary and military aid to countries facing the threat of the spread of communism, and the Marshall Plan, which offered money to European countries recovering from the war. In 1949, the United States joined Canada and 10 European countries to establish the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as a defense against the Soviet threat. Soviet-backed Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States and the United Nations supported South Korea, and the Communist Soviets and China supported North Korea. The Korean War, which started in 1950, ended in 1953 with the establishment of a neutral buffer zone between the two countries. The Cold War extended from Earth to space in 1957. In October 1957, the Soviet satellite Sputnik 1 entered Earth orbit. In response, the U.S. satellite Explorer 1 was launched in January 1958. The USA ended the space war in 1969 by landing the first man on the Moon. Since the Soviet Union installed nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962, the United States demanded the removal of the missiles. The tension, called the Cuban Missile Crisis, ended after 2 weeks when the Soviet Union removed the missiles. In the 1960s, African Americans began protesting unfair laws. Martin Luther King Jr., the best-known leader of the civil rights movement, chose nonviolent methods. President Kennedy introduced a civil rights bill to Congress in June 1963. However, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. His successor, President Johnson, had Congress pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Many African Americans complained about slow progress. Riots started again after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Since the early 1960s, rebels supported by the Communist government of North Vietnam were trying to overthrow the anti-communist government of South Vietnam. U.S. President Nixon sent troops and supplies to South Vietnam. In 1967, approximately 500,000 U.S. soldiers were in South Vietnam. As a result of anti-war protests, the United States decided to withdraw its troops. A peace agreement was signed in 1973, but conflicts continued after the U.S. withdrew. President Nixon was elected for a second term following his successful administration. It was later revealed that he won the presidency thanks to illegal activities. After the so-called Watergate incident, Nixon resigned in 1974. The late 1970s and 1980s continued with energy crises and economic problems. Presidents have tried to find solutions to these problems. The 80s continued with the nuclear weapons agreement signed with the Soviets. As a result of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the United States led the countries fighting against Iraq. The so-called Gulf War began in January 1991 and ended with the defeat of Iraq 6 weeks later. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in late 1991, the United States became the world's only superpower. 10 years later, on September 11, 2001, the United States faced the largest terrorist attack in its history. 2 of the 4 planes hijacked by terrorists crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. 1 crashed into the Pentagon and the last one crashed in Pennsylvania. The USA held Osama bin Laden responsible for the attacks that resulted in the death of approximately 3,000 people. Additionally, the Afghan government accused the Taliban of protecting bin Laden and his organization. A month later, the USA launched an attack on Afghanistan. A year later, the United States accused the Iraqi government of terrorist ties. Additionally, Iraq was not implementing the weapons ban that was sanctioned by the Gulf War in 1991. President Saddam Hussein refused to cooperate with investigators. The issue was brought to the United Nations in 2002 and US-led troops invaded Iraq. During the 2008 elections, the Afghanistan and Iraq wars were continuing. The economic crisis that occurred in the same year increased citizens' dissatisfaction with the government and brought about change. Barack Obama won the election and became the first African American president of the U.S. In 2010, the USA left Iraq, but the war continued in Afghanistan. In 2011, the United States participated in operations against the Libyan government. That same year, U.S. forces killed bin Laden in Pakistan. In 2014, the group called ISIS began to capture important cities in Iraq and Syria. The USA carried out attacks against this organization. The USA left Afghanistan in 2021.